Okay, I did my research topic on if childhood trauma is a direct indicator of criminal activity. Let you guys write it down for a second. I decided to do this because I always think that crime shows and documentaries and stuff are really interesting, so figured it would be pretty easy to write about and interesting to end all the final presentations on. Okay, so I define childhood trauma as serious adverse childhood experiences, so that can be abuse, neglect, etc. I also would say that divorce in the family can also lead to childhood trauma. And then criminal activity, murder, robbery, etc. It could be anything from a small stealing incident to serial killing. So kind of a broad spectrum, but we'll see. Okay, the question is, does childhood trauma lead to criminal activity? On this chart, you can see from conception to death. It starts with generational embodiment, historical trauma, local context, and social conditions, just that stuff that is given to everybody when they're born. But I think it really takes a turn when we get to adverse childhood experiences, because if something is different from the rest of the people that you're around, that's what sets the rest of your expectations for your life and where you're going to be. I really think that changes, and then it goes into disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, health being mental health as well, disease, disability, and social problems, early death, whether that be death penalty or just natural causes. Okay, using criminals' backgrounds, I took more of an anecdotal approach of using actual criminals. Does anybody know who this is? Jeffrey Dahmer. Okay, so he was in Wisconsin. He's responsible for 16 killings. He also had some sexual misconduct before then. He actually grew up with both of his parents. His mom was known to be bipolar, and his parents got divorced. They both kind of went their own separate ways, and he was stuck by himself with his own mental health going downhill, and that's what ended up leading to all of the criminal activity. Who's this? Charles Manson. Yeah, so he grew up, actually, he was born when his mom was 16. He was involved in an armed robbery when he was like 6 months old, still a baby with his mom. He is is part of a cult with his family, also had to do with multiple murders, 8 to be exact. So he had a rough upbringing as well. And who is this? Yeah, Ted Bundy. So he's in Utah, or he was in Utah in the 70s, went to law school at the U actually, so he's pretty familiar. He actually had some weird stuff when he was younger, kind of left him in an identity crisis and left him at a weird spot just from the beginning. This video is kind of more about his upbringing.
Family and environment. Nothing has more influence on a child's development than his or her family. At an early age, Bundy was entangled in a domestic conspiracy that made him believe that his grandparents were actually his parents. Not only that, but he was told his mother was his sister. His family's true identity was hidden from Bundy for many years. This was to protect the reputation of Bundy's actual mother, who was young and unwed. Bundy never knew his father. His identity was never determined. As a result, Bundy grew up resentful and mistrustful of who should have inspired absolute trust. 4. After Bundy's mother came clean, she moved herself and Ted out of the house of lies. She wanted to give her son a fresh chance at a normal life, so she changed her identity yet again to separate her and Ted from her parents. This was further realized when she married a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who gave Ted the name for which he'd be known. However, Ted's mother and Johnny had 4 of their own children, and they monopolized their parents' attention. Ted's frustration mounted as the very person that had him unwillingly separated from his parental figures now neglected him, and as a result, he withdrew. Already pathologically shy, Ted distanced himself from his family and peers and took refuge in a fantasy world where he wasn't a powerless victim of circumstance. In his mind, he could be anything he wanted.
Okay, so with that being said, I think that when people grow up in environments where they're not absolutely comfortable or with parents that are nurturing to them, they grow up in a way that they want power and control over their own lives, whether that means they have to take control over someone else's. Let's see. Okay, and then the no side of this, that childhood trauma would not lead to this. Does anybody know who this is? Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. So he actually he grew up with his brother and his parents in a very nice gated community in New York. And he ended up being a criminal for sexual misconduct. You may know him for Epstein's Island. He had multiple estates, a lot of secretive stuff going on with that. He also associated with very high-class people, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, etc. So he made a pretty big name in the world and had a pretty good upbringing. When I was looking at criminals to kind of get both sides of this, obviously I have just 3 for the yes side. There's plenty that you can find with pretty messed up childhoods to get into their criminal activity. However, Jeffrey Epstein was really the only prevalent criminal that had a pretty decent childhood. With that being said, I think that childhood trauma can most definitely cause criminal circumstances. And at first I thought that there was no way that childhood trauma truly can change a person and change what their future is going to look like. I thought that that was just kind of an evil spot inside of somebody's heart that would get that to them. But after researching certain criminals, I really do think that childhood trauma has a direct impact on their future and on their criminal activity. And then there's my works cited. Questions? Yeah.
Do you think that people with childhood trauma can also go like the better route and kind of like, instead of being criminals, being successful and like helping with stuff that they've been through?
Yeah, I think there's a turning point in trauma where people can either use it to their advantage, whether that means like going into the depths of society and trying to turn everything against them and figure out their life that way. But I also think that people can come above that and make a good change and advocate for people that go through the same struggles. Anything else? Sweet, thank you guys.